Among other things, it's the 50th anniversary of Project Censored, and it is the time now where they publish their retrospective uncensored stories of the year. So, first of all, Mickey, welcome back.
RJ, I thank you so much for having us back on the program to talk about the work that we've been doing for going to be 50 years now. Coming up next year is our 50th anniversary. And again, it's just always an honor to be in dialogue with you. Have great respect for you and your program and the important things that you do.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's certainly more than mutual. Well, let's start with the 50th anniversary. You know, in your introduction to the book on the news that didn't make the news, so to speak, for the past year, you pulled what I thought was a nice little authorial move in your foreword. You set up this very dramatic, our country stands at a precipice. The United States is teetering perilously rising economic inequality, nuclear threats to civil rights and all that. And then you pull the old bait and switch and say, it would be reasonable to conclude that this preceding package describes our present circumstances, which of course it does, preceding passage, as you should say, but it could just as easily have referred to the nation in the mid 70s, the withdrawal from Vietnam, the wake of the Watergate crisis, and so on. So you create a kind of wormhole between the mid 2020s and the mid 1970s. And how relevant do you think that is, if this doesn't seem like too off the wall a question? How relevant do you think that those parallels are to the mission of Project Censored 50 years on?
I think that they're profound, and I think that Carl Jensen, the founder, was prescient. And, and I mean, I'm an historian by day, right? By trade. I was a professor of history for 25 years in Northern California. So I inhabit that world of storytelling, past to present, journalism in the public interest, independent, media in particular. And so, really thinking about why did Project Censored come about in the first place? It wasn't something that was spearheaded by some big financiers. It wasn't something that was greeted with warmly by the establishment press or media at the time, despite the fact that Carl had support of the great I.F. Stone, Izzy Stone. He had the support of Walter Cronkite, Hugh Downs, some pretty big names in both print and broadcast journalism. Most people in the press saw what Carl was doing as, well, he was criticizing them, but they kind of thought he was hostile. And going back to the 1970s, hostility was kind of all over the place, as you recall. And again, I think now we're in a very similar kind of situation, different, but as oft attributed to Mark Twain, history might not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I was riffing on those rhymes in the introduction because, Carl got the idea for Project Censored after Watergate. And the interesting part wasn't that, one of the big lessons that came out of Watergate, I wouldn't say was the main one or shouldn't be, in my view. The press came up and Woodward and Bernstein saved the day and they outed the crimes of Nixon and they moved him to resignation and the system works. But right after that, in the church committee hearings, we learned about a whole bunch of other monstrous crimes that were going on. And then after a little while, they just kind of quietly closed up the church committee hearings, and the Pike Commission over in the House didn't get very far as the public went. And it was sort of like, well, okay, let's just stop with Watergate and the system worked and move on. And of course, what came next was the Reagan Revolution and the massive rightward shift in our political culture that was continued by the Clinton administration and the Democrats. So Carl's question, I think, is something that's more instrumental that came out of the Watergate scandal, which was he went back and looked at the 72 election and said, knowing that these crimes were being committed, including others that Nixon was involved in, why did it take so long for the press to cover this
Right.
and find out about it? Not, thank goodness they did, but Why did the independent and alternative media, why were they reporting about it? And then even after they were reporting about it, why were so few people at places like the Washington Post actually covering it? And why did, by the way, the Nixon White House call Walter Cronkite's boss at CBS to tell him to suppress and squelch and turn down an expose that Cronkite was airing on Watergate? That's a prior restraint problem. That's not
Right.
even censorship by proxy. That's exactly the kind of censorship that the First Amendment allegedly protects against. And so Carl Jensen, the founder of Project Censored, said, what else do we not know in enough time to do something about it? And so he really started looking at the independent and alternative press as sort of a canary in the coal mine, as a distant early warning system about people that were on the ground writing about things and telling stories and trying to amplify them, where the corporate media either couldn't hear them or they had conflicts of interest that made it impossible for them to actually act on those stories. And so Carl, and this is before media literacy was even like a phrase or a buzzword in academia. Carl was promoting news media literacy by starting a class called Project Censored. And he had students, and this is back in the day, no cable yet, certainly no internet. This is back when you had multiple dailies in a lot of cities and you had periodicals and so on. He subscribed to hundreds of these things, and students literally poured over independent media documents to find stories that the New York Times missed, that CBS News missed, right? So back to that issue where I mentioned that those in the establishment press sometimes looked at Carl as more of an enemy of sorts. And Carl said, no, no, no. I love the First Amendment, and I think the media has the power to do great good. But we've got to get rid of these conflicts of interest. We've got to get rid of the notion that journalism is about buck raking. And we got to get back to the fact that it's about muck raking, right? And that was a great line that Carl had, is that journalism schools should be producing more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers, because he thought the effort
That's
would
good.
be worth it,
Yeah.
right? And he was right about that. And Peter Phillips, 20 years later, picked up the baton from Carl. He turned it from a list of annual stories that students and judges, Carl went out and asked people like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and other people in the media ecosystem to help vet stories and rank stories. And then in 1993, he started doing an annual book, right? And so that got picked up by Peter Phillips and Seven Stories, Dan Simon at Seven Stories Press, and we continued to do that until we started the Censored Press in 2021. This year's 50th anniversary book is the first Censored Press solo publication that looks back at 50 years of Project Censored, but it includes Carl's coining of junk food news, right? When the corporate media came back and said, hey, this is not fair. We don't cover stories because of censorship, it's news judgment. So then Carl started looking at what they were covering, and it was a bunch of sensationalist, titillating garbage. And he called that junk food news in 1983. Peter Phillips later talked about how they cover serious stories in trivial or contextless ways, and he called that news abuse propaganda. So over the years, Project Censored isn't just about lionizing the independent press and critiquing the corporate media. It's about looking at how junk food news poisons our culture and our news environment, how propaganda is more the norm in establishment journalism than the exception, and how we can also work to lionize nonprofit groups and First Amendment groups as they support free expression and free speech as important adjuncts of support for a free press. And so I see Project Censored 50 years later, for better and worse, as being maybe more needed and more necessary now as we face the challenges we do in the digital era, of everything from post-truth to brain rot, as the Oxford Dictionary favorite words of the years have been. And now this year, the Oxford Dictionary word of the year is rage bait. And that's mostly what we see in our media landscape, is polarizing half-truths that just really don't get to the crux of what George Seldes said the role of media and journalism happened to be in the 20th century. And he said that role is to tell the public what's really going on, so we can be meaningfully civically engaged and we have a fair chance at having our ideas, sort of work out in the society, and so that we can try to build a better country and a better world. And I think that journalism is still, although it's fledgling and trust in the fourth estate is flagging amazingly, I think that a lot of faith can be restored by looking at the top independent stories each year, both that we cover in the Project Censored top censored story list, and also for the Izzy Award winners named after I.F. Stone that we do every spring at the Park Center for Independent Media.
And let me start with this. And by the way, first of all, for those who don't know, I.F. Stone, obviously, distinguished journalist, member of the journalist class, who was basically, I don't want to go into a whole I.F. Stone, biography, but, basically had to publish independently, self-publish in order to write what he wanted to write. So I.F. Stone's Weekly lasted for decades. And by the way, Mickey, you'll appreciate this. In a used bookstore, I found a collection of Izzy's writings that I think ended in 54 from I.F. Stone's Week. It was like the first 5 years of, and it was
53, 54.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, RJ. Sorry.
So it was, I think the Weekly started in 49, if I'm not mistaken.
I thought it was the early 50s, but nevertheless, it spanned roughly that period to the early 70s. Yeah,
this was in the 50s that this book was published, and it was really the equivalent of what we think of as blog posts today, from what Truman was doing that day, and it's just exactly the street level, inner machinery made comprehensible that journalism should be daily, weekly, monthly, in book form, whatever. But before we go on, you said a phrase that triggered a lot in me, because I remember my feelings about it at the time, and I riffed about it a little bit with you, and maybe I'll even write about it. But I remember this now. I was pretty young when Watergate happened. Like college age, or leaving college or whatever. But I was only tangentially in college, but that's another. And the system worked. I really hated that expression and that mindset then. And I think it lives now at different forms. And that's why I wanted to stop and put a bookmarker on it. At the time, it was what self-satisfied, highly paid news anchors loved to say after Nixon resigned, right? It was the system worked. But wait a minute, I could drive home blind drunk and say, if I make it home, driving drunk works, right? I got home. Well, that's just one time.
That's right, man.
Right. And from the journalistic point of view, the one effing story that they told us about got semi-resolved. It didn't get really resolved, but it got, because all the people Nixon brought in, Kissinger and these other monsters stayed in power. So it didn't get completely resolved. But you know what? What about all the stories you never told us about? The system didn't work there because we didn't even hear about it. But you're assuming because one thing turned out okay, that the system always turns out okay. And that's the opposite. That's analysis by anecdote, right? And to me, that's parenthetical. The last thing or antithetical to journalism. The last thing you said was, that George said the journalist's obligation is to tell the public what's going on. Well, that doesn't just mean spewing a few set of random facts with a parenthesis at each end so you can make a story.
It means connecting the dots. Connecting the dots,
providing the context, interpretation, which is not only not cherished anymore in journalism, it's actually actively abhorred and objected to in certain mainstream journalism. If a journalist tries to say, well, the occupation of Palestine has been going on for X number of years, and there have been these initial, oh no, don't editorialize.
Somehow facts are editorial.
7th, don't report on October 6th. Don't contextualize that. And isn't that part of the mission of the projects you're working on too, that we cannot, as journalists, abdicate that responsibility even when it makes people unhappy with us, or God forbid, limits our job opportunities?
That's why 100% RJ, and that's why we especially need to support the kind of independent public interest journalism guided by the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. That's why we need to follow the facts where they lead. That I love your unpacking of the system work business, because the irony is that it did for the people in power. Nixon enjoyed an incredibly hagiographic restoration, right, for the rest of his life. Kissinger died, basically, and people were still lionizing him as some great expert of foreign policy, rather than as you categorized him, as the murderous monster he was, that the late great Anthony Bourdain even went on to talk about, as like anybody that's been to Cambodia probably wants to strangle Kissinger, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not advocating violence, but
No.
I'm simply saying that it's unpopular sometimes to say the things that are really happening. And in the corporate media, in the for-profit world, they have too many things at stake. They have too many conflicts of interest. They have too many paymasters that they have to please one way or another. And so the stories often get filtered, right? Forget about the fact that some stories don't get covered at all. Like that's a real problem. I don't mean forget about it. I mean just putting that aside momentarily. Even when they do cover a story, like you suggested, they'll both sides it to death. I'll be outside at a monsoon getting soaked in rain, and they'll be like, "So tell us about the weather." And I'll be like, "Man, it's totally raining out here." Then we'll go to somebody else and they'll be like, "Well, I was just out there. It's not raining at all." Well, you've just heard both sides. Now off to the commercial
Right,
about why
right.
you don't need rain gear. I mean, it's just the kind of thing that it's turned into is a stenographic machine for people in power. And we've seen
Okay,
that
but
in this
that's two
administration.
problems. I want to stop you, excuse
Yeah,
me,
go
just
ahead.
for a
Yeah,
second, because I want to break apart. You're really talking about two problems when you switch to the
yeah,
stenography, journalism and stenography.
yeah,
One, the both sidesism problem is, uh, let's say, is a reporting on Gaza in the last year, at best in the mainstream media, has been both sidesism. Well, Gaza Health Ministry says another 10,000 people have died, and then Israel denies, that. But a year before that, it was, and for ad infinitum since the 1940s, before that, it was another problem, which is the stenography problem, which was going
yeah,
to, and this is bipartisan. I mean, this is under
yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
Biden, and as well as Trump or George W. Bush or whomever, that, well, Anthony Blinken says blah blah blah, or Hillary Clinton says, well, there was what was her word? There was a ceasefire on October 6th, which would be news. The thousands of Gazans killed,
Yeah.
in the first quarter of the 21st century. But so that, I would say, you talked about junk food news, which I think of as the dumb human interest, and it could bleed
Yeah.
over into the news, what Harry and Meghan and, those jerks in a
Taylor
royal,
Swift. Yeah.
like I could care. But then there's also, I think, spiked food news, right? Which is the news that is stenography, the news that lets you believe
Yeah.
that what Mike Pompeo or Anthony Blinken or any of these, or Joe Biden or Donald Trump say, well, they're a little tougher on Trump, but what they say is the truth, or the political
Yeah.
assumptions of the news class. So to them, fake news can include news that challenges their narrative. But I think
Yeah.
when they're not giving us junk food, they're often spiking the food with an ideological perspective and a stenographic,
Mm.
role to power, that it's also incumbent on us people, those of us who consider ourselves media critics, to call out. What do you think?
We do a chapter every year in the book called News Abuse, and that's exactly what it is. It's the accepting of the narratives without question, without challenge, even though we know there are facts that contradict that narrative, right? It's a willful ignorance. The stenography is like, I'm just writing down what I need to, what we're supposed to tell you, right? And anything else outside that Overton window doesn't count as news or information, even if you have all the evidence in the world for it, right? It's like a cardinal sin, as Emma Goldman once said, the most unpardonable sin in society is independence of thought. Journalists need to be independent critical thinkers in order to help people contextually understand complicated stories in ways where they're not just telling the story they're being paid to tell, they're actually telling a story because it deserves to be told on the basis of evidence and on the basis of the impact of how it affects us in the real world. And you had mentioned, of course, Izzy Stone building off of George Selby's. This goes back to Upton Sinclair and the brass check in 1919 and the golden era of muckraking with Lincoln Steffens and Ida
Right.
Tarbell. We have a history where we had journalists really telling the public what was going on, and the powerful noticed it. And they turned it into yellow journalism and sensationalist tripe so that they could water it down and weaken the Fourth Estate, the degree to which that it would turn into an adjunct of the advertising business for commercial media as it was turning into radio and television and then cable and now the internet. That's a long story, but we've had a lot of these people along the way. And I would say from people like Sinclair and Seldes and I.F. Stone to Carl Jensen, right? Ben Bigdicky and the media monopoly, Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky, in the manufacturing consent in 1988. Backing up, I missed an historian that most people forget all about that wrote one of the most important books, I think, out of the 1960s. And it was a book called The Image, A Guide to Pseudo Events in America by Daniel Borston, who was actually a pretty centrist conservative
Yeah.
historian that predicted all of this mess of social media and confirmation bias and propaganda and fake news. And he spread the blame out, which I thought was brilliant because he not only blamed the political establishment and the increased commercialization of media, he blamed the American public for having extraordinary expectations and demanding instant gratification and expecting impossible things and then expecting to pay for it so that the media would generate the narratives and the myths because they thought that that's what we wanted to believe. So it's this very bizarre symbiotic system of well, I guess you could say mis, dis, and malinformative propaganda that has created this epistemic crisis of the post-truth conundrum that we now inhabit, to where there's Team Red and Team Blue aren't even talking about the same issues in the same ways. They're ships passing in the night. There's not even a common language culturally, politically at this juncture where we can sit in a room with people who have very different ideas, where we have any prospect of understanding each other in a meaningful way to go out and make the world a better place. And I view the failures of the Fourth Estate as chief among how we became this Tower of Babel culture, right? But I don't think there's not something we can do about it. I think the Fourth Estate needs to reverse the trend. Journalists have an obligation to not stand by while the president of the United States refers to a working journalist as piggy or to attack somebody in the press corps. Journalists have an obligation to stand together in solidarity and say, this is unacceptable. This violates the social contract. This violates the rules that we
Right.
all have to play by. And it was wrong when Biden did it and shut down debate and dissent over the pandemic. It's wrong when Biden did it to shut down
Exactly.
dissent and dissent around Gaza. And it's wrong for Trump to do it now around Israel, Gaza. It's wrong for Trump to have a compact for higher education. It is wrong for Trump to be going after dissidents and protesters and students and try to deport people in the name of protecting free speech of some two-bit grifter. We know who I'm referring to that was had a very unfortunate tragedy befall them. The right has never been interested in free speech and expression for anyone other than themselves. And they routinely wrap themselves in the cloak of it as they categorically call other people with whom they disagree fake news and trammel their careers and their reputations. The Democrats help pave the way to this hellhole we're in right now, RJ2. But that's why we need the independent journalistic angles to go after the tough stories, to call it like it is, and remind the American public that this experiment we're floundering around into the 250th year has no guarantee to
Absolutely not.
continue into
And
the future.
I was thinking as you were talking, Mickey, that and I think I have to read the Borstin book now, but I was thinking that one of the phenomena that I think is new in the last 10 years, or it's new to me,
Mhm.
Borstin and others may have seen it coming, but it is the consumption of news has become, in many cases, a declaration of tribal identity. Or
Mm.
if you're on Team
Branding,
Red,
branding. Team
self
Red, Team Blue branding.
self branding. Uh,
Yeah.
that instead of wearing a soccer shirt that says Team Red, I watch Fox and listen to these right wing maniacs. Or instead of saying Team Blue, I watch MSNBC now, MS Now, or whatever.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'll tell you when I noticed it. You mentioned it in your introduction, Russiagate. Uh, I remember 2017 when everybody was saying Russia did this or Russia did that, and Trump is, what do they call it? A resource for the KGB, an asset for the KGB,
Yeah.
and there was compromat and all this stuff that people were saying.
Prop or not, Marty Barron at the Washington Post trumpeting blatant propaganda.
Right,
I mean, it was just
that the
rehashed
Russians
McCarthyite Red Scare. Yeah,
that they hacked a Vermont nuclear plant. I mean, we could
which they
go
did.
on, and we could go on and on. And I kept saying, there's no evidence for any of this stuff. What we're getting out of John Brennan or James Clapper, a documented.
Clapper, who lied under oath to Congress
I
that
was just
sparked
about to
Snowden
say,
to leak.
yeah, documented perjurer, uh, which undocumented silly assertions that RT television changed the election outcome. What, the 3,700 people who used to watch RT television, and 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 I remember a Democratic actually backer of my show when they started ranting about this stuff, and I started to give my usual spiel. They said, "Oh, that's right, you're a Russia skeptic." And I
Yeah, no, you're on the payroll. Putin was paying you, wasn't
Oh, I
he?
got that a lot. But this person
Yeah. So
was
did
was
we.
was
So did we.
classier than that. They said a Russia skeptic. And
Ah,
I said, I'm an everything skeptic. That's the
yes,
job, right?
that
And
is the
and
job.
someone else, I remember, uh, a good friend, a great person, she was saying, Trump did this, Trump did that. And I said, you really can't get your information from MSNBC. This stuff is liberal fake news. And she said, listen to me, Mickey, listen, this is important. She said, I know, but it's fun.
Yeah, it's like a guilty pleasure of like the other side does it, so if
Right.
we don't do it, we're losing or we're missing out. FOMO. And it's piling on. Nolan Higdon and I wrote a piece back then, and it was at Counterpunch and a few other places. It was called From Russiagate with Love.
Good title.
And it listed 10, 20 things that you were rattling off about. Listen, yes, there's problems with Russia. Yes, there's problems with KGB. Yes, there's problems internal to their society. Yes, they have all kind of things going on. We're not lionizing them in any way. However, we get nowhere by repeating blatant falsehoods because they support some Team Blue propaganda against Trump. There's plenty of actual things that we could be criticizing and talking about rather than going out and manufacturing whole cloth what MSNBC turned into a cottage industry,
Right.
right? That's what that feeds right into it, so that if you actually know that those stories are bogus, then you're left saying like, well, what happened to these groups? And what happened, we wrote about in the United States of Distraction, is that the fourth estate got sucked into the dark carnival of the three ring circus,
Yep.
right? Where they
Yep.
are no longer outside covering it. They are inside access compromised people that are back to stenography. They're telling the stories that they think each other want to hear, and they've lost entirely sight of what's going on in the general American public.
100%. And this has become, Roxy Music said love is the drug. Now fake news is the drug, that
I
and
prefer music, but yes.
and I just yes, I do too. But so I guess maybe as a last, kind of, I was also thinking about this as I was reading the censored stories. People can get the book to get the stories. The stories are important, but the concepts to me are the real issue, right, Maggie? And to me, one of the things that I think has been lost, whether it's in politics or journalism, which are now unfortunately grafted on one another like some freakish, a horror movie experiment. The is and I'll boil it down to one word: respect. Respect for the
Uh-huh.
reader, respect for the voter, respect. Okay, we know that yellow journalists and the Fox types, haven't had that for a while, but I've seen it. I've gotten to talk privately with politicians on both sides of the aisle. There's a marked absence of respect there. And I would argue in the profession of journalism, there's a marked absence of respect too. There is a widespread belief that people are just too effing dumb to, yeah. And by the way, this is ancient. This is as old as America in one way, shape, or form. It's
Yeah.
Hamiltonianism.
Yes.
It's the Lippmann Dewey debates. It's the bewildered
Eddie
herd,
Bernays,
the bewildered herd, as
bewildered herd, and Eddie Bernays, right?
yeah,
The
yeah,
the smart people. Yeah, yeah.
all of the above. So we're the smart people. We have to guide them, or just give them whatever the hell they want so that we can, get a bonus this year. But whatever it is, there's no, and this contempt for Trump voters, uh, as if we in the journalism profession aren't more guilty by far than the average human being for people. We haven't told them, and Democrats are, of course, very good, completely guilty, but we haven't told them how things could be. Journalists haven't told them deeply what's fallacious about Trump. And his movement. They do so while trying to,
They dance on the surface. Yeah.
yeah, they dance on the surface, right? Exactly, while trying to preserve the systems in place that they benefit from, and
The
then they
system
tell
is
the,
working again.
yeah, right,
The
right, right,
system
exactly.
is still working, RJ.
Still working after all. It takes a licking and keeps on ticking, as the old
Yeah,
advertisement.
yeah.
And they don't. I mean, they think people are going to be impressed, and Democrats think they're going to be impressed in their convention videos if they bring out John Kasich or some other, desiccated Republican and say we stand at a crossroads while he's standing at a literal two crossroads, and they wonder why they don't go for that stuff. So it seems to me journalists, and I'm talking about mass media, not just specialty audience, lefty, or what have you. Mass media has got to be able to say, what, people are smart enough by and large that if I say, and I think a lot of polling now shows that, the turning against Israel and the occupation, the outrage of corporations and billionaires, the widespread desire to raise taxes on the aforementioned, whatever it is, people are catching on even without journalists. People are ahead of the journalistic profession. I
Yes.
think it's about time. Respect where respect is due. They're ahead of colleagues in professional journalism. So instead of looking down on them, maybe if anything, you should look slightly up on them and
Yes.
skew your reporting to what they can comprehend that you dare not or will not tell them.
I think, so well put, RJ. And I think that the theme there, and one of the key words that is obviously screaming to the fore, is respect. And I would suggest, of course, or lack thereof. And I think that the press is at a low point in public trust because it's not only lost respect for the public, the press has lost respect for itself as a venerable institution. By getting sucked into the name calling and the circus, and by not standing in solidarity when other people in their profession are being run roughshod over, called petty names, fined millions of dollars, capitulating and bending the knee at the acquiescing, to the billionaire class. The billionaire class. They want this, they want that. They'll throw the fourth estate right under the bus. The fourth estate needs to gain its own respect back, and it needs to gain the respect that it needs to desperately gain the respect back of the American public. And the best way to do that, going back to George Seldes, is to tell the public what's actually going on. And at Project Censored for 50 years, if I might, we, one, have been championing and promoting independent public interest journalism. Two, we hold corporate media to account when they fail to provide news coverage that adequately informs the public as community members and global citizens. Number three, For 50 years, we've provided hands-on critical media literacy training to students, and we make that work public. We practice what we teach, and we want to lead by example. And public interest ethical journalism is the best way to show people how to talk about tough issues and learn about historical context and be meaningfully civically engaged. And number four, we believe that increasing public awareness of, trust in, and support for independent journalists is one essential dimension of every movement that addresses injustices at home and abroad. And I think that supporting the independence of media is a great way to show people how truth-telling journalism can make a difference. And dare we say, maybe even turn a profit. As you suggested, RJ, people are turning against the establishment narratives, which would imply that if the corporate media would go and begin really exposing, like the independent press do, exposing the issues that the public already surmises, smells, and suspects, they could have a groundswell of new support. They could have a groundswell of a new audience that begins to trust the media to help be in it together to solve the challenges we face and not be a petty adjunct of the billionaire class.
Now, I'll bet people can support that work at projectcensored.org, by the way. But
Yeah.
fair. But in close, in my last thought, I'll give you the last word, Mickey. But my last thought is this: just in terms of, I'm not a big one on awards or best of the year collections, but I've been in a couple, and
Mhm.
I'll tell you what, it feels nice, right? When somebody says, you did good work this year, it is.
That's true.
So I'm gonna say that one of my hopes going forward, I think it's already true, but one of the reasons I love to amplify Project Censored and the work you do every year on underreported news stories is I want journalists, I want that to be a kind of behavioral mod program, right?
Yes.
I want people to say, I got in this because I wanted to investigate, not because I wanted to make, a nice living. I like to make a nice living, but what I really love is to be in Project Censored's collection anthology next year. So I don't,
Yeah.
you can tell us, and I think you already did, what Project Censored will be doing in the next year or two. But and next 50, hope if it comes to that. But my hope is that it will continue to and expand its role in behavioral mod and turning journalists by name into journalists by profession.
Well, RJ, I'm really glad you brought that up. Certainly, the kind of work that you do and the reporting that you do, in my estimation, is completely in the annals of the kind of work that we honor at Project Censored, that we honor at the Park Center with the Izzy Awards. For all the people that end up in the books and get the awards, there are so many other people that are part of the independent ecosystem that are doing amazing work. Last
Yeah.
year, we had a record number of Izzy nominations at the Park Center. We had 90 nominations. Go online next week, parkindymedia.org. We're going to launch our new website. The nominations for the Izzies will be out. And Project Censored, you can nominate stories anytime that our students can go and research, RJ. You can self-nominate, you can send your own work in. And the reason that we do that is when we celebrate those very groups and the people maybe that are up on the stage, we're celebrating everybody that makes that work possible and supports that ethos behind the significance of public interest journalism and how media literacy, critical media literacy, really helps foster it and bring it about. And so you can go to projectcensored.org to check out the book. We've got the whole list of stories going back to 1976 for free. The radio show's free. There's so much of the work we do online for free. RJ, I'm really glad that you brought it up. I'd love to see you and many others here celebrating the Izzies in April at Ithaca College. And again, Project Censored's having a big 50th anniversary event here at Ithaca College with the Union for Democratic Communications in October. So again, I hope that we don't have such a gap between our chatting with one another as we did this past year. And a lot of work to do, RJ. And I just really appreciate being in the same ecosystem with people like you that get up and do it every day for all the right reasons.
Me too. Likewise, and we all as human beings need solidarity. So building the
Absolutely.
solidarity among independent journalists is a service to. So I
We're
think we
not
both agree.
competitors and we're not rivals. We
No,
got to
no,
do this
that's
together and we got to elevate and amplify, each other's work as we can, right? And that's a really important part of the message. It's not about scooping each other, it's about building on to that pile of knowledge and information.
Yeah, independent but mutually supportive.
Absolutely.
And with that, Mickey Huff, Project Censored. When the new website comes online, let me know and we'll put it up at
Yep.
zerohourreport.com. So as
Mhm.
always, man, thanks for your great work. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, RJ. People can go to projectcensored.org and parkindymedia.org.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.